Hallo alle sammen. Now I'm going to introduce Natasha Hausdorff. I'm impressed of all Natasha Hausdorff has done. She has represent a wide range of international clients in Crown Court, county and magistrates courts, and employment and property tribunals as a spokeswoman that gives advice on criminal and civilian cases. After a legal degree at the Oxford University, she worked for the President of Israel's High Court in Jerusalem. In 2018, as a Pegasus Scholar, Natasha was a scholarship holder at Columbia Law School in National Security Loan Program. Welcome, Natasha, and please, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be back with you this afternoon to discuss some of the recent developments in the NGO battle against Israel. On the 1st of February this year, Amnesty International released a report entitled Israel's Apartheid Against Palestinians, Cruel System of Domination and Crime Against Humanity. Now, the 287-page report continued a long history of levying false and malicious charges against Israel by Amnesty International. The report singles out and targets Israel with the allegation that it is an apartheid state, and it forms part of the NGO-led campaign to delegitimize and isolate Israel. It's based essentially on the 2001 Durban NGO Forum, which you heard a little bit about yesterday from Sean Sachs of NGO Monitor. Now, this report wasn't exactly novel. Despite Amnesty claiming that the document was original research, our friends at NGO Monitor have done a very interesting comparison with other reports, including the Human Rights Watch report, A Threshold Crossed, Israeli Authorities and the Crimes of Apartheid and Persecution. That was published in April 2001. And they've documented the collection and the repetition of the verbal contortions, the discredited claims, which have largely been copied from other NGOs with the same agenda. We see the same specific language, the recycled accusations, the distortions, and the tropes. Now, the anti-Israel NGO network has that circular, self-affirming relationship, so there's no great surprise that there is a similarity of tropes and misinformation. I just want to outline some of the key themes that NGO Monitor summarized, and this report included anti-Semitic tropes, such as Jewish supremacy or domination, an artificially constructed and incoherent definition of the term apartheid, exploiting the apartheid framework, singling out Israel uniquely and without comparison to other countries, deleting the history and the context of the conflict, including Palestinian terror and war crimes, recommendations of sanctions and other punitive measures to isolate and delegitimize Israel in accordance with that 2001 Durban NGO plan of action, and rejection of Israel's identity as a Jewish state and the denial of the Jewish people's right to sovereign equality and self-determination. Now, within that, we have several examples of anti-Semitism according to the consensus under the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism. Now, the report has come under fierce condemnation from around the world, with many calling it out for its blatant anti-Semitism, but it's clearly part of a broader initiative, and we've seen precursor reports off of that same hymn sheet from B'Tselem, from Human Rights Watch, from the indeed former UN Special Rapporteur Michael Link. We're awaiting a great deal more from the UN Human Rights Council in the form of its so-called Commission of Inquiry. And I've been asked to speak about the title, Israel and Human Rights and Why Amnesty is So Wrong. So I propose first to give a brief overview of the human rights framework in Israel, then to look at some examples from the report by Amnesty International, and finally to look at the strategy at play, which this report forms part of, and I'm very excited to take your questions. So to start off with a brief overview of human rights in Israel. Now, you're here at MIF, so I'm going to take it as a given that you know that Israel is a vibrant human rights protecting democracy. But what is the law behind this? Israel does not have a written constitution. Unlike here in Norway, where the constitution of the Kingdom of Norway provides for human rights provisions in Articles 92 to 113 of the Norwegian constitution. So Israel doesn't have that kind of centralized document. The human rights dynamic in Israel is informed by what are called basic laws, foundational laws, originally intended to form the basis of a future constitution, but between fighting for its survival through a succession of wars, unfortunately, the government of Israel never got to the point where they could finally get together and pass a constitution. So it's been done incrementally. And the key basic law that you should bear in mind when thinking about human rights in Israel is the Human Dignity and Liberty Basic Law from 1992. It's a major tool for safeguarding human rights and liberties, indeed civil liberties, in the State of Israel. It states, human rights in Israel are based on the recognition of the value of the human being, the sanctity of his life. And it provides that every human being is entitled to protection of his life, body, and dignity. Now, Western liberal democracies have processes for regulating human rights protections and holding government institutions to account through judicial processes. In Israel, the Supreme Court, where I worked for a time as the clerk to then President, the late Chief Justice Miriam Naor, the Supreme Court sits as the ultimate arbiter of many of these issues, and due process constraints are embedded in national law. And these processes are in keeping with international human rights obligations that Israel has undertaken, notably under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which it is signatory to. So in the international arena, human rights are altogether more nebulous. International legal practice is largely unaccountable, which is why so often it's so political, and why international legal institutions have become so powerful politically. Without any international legal due process to review the exercises of these institutions, they arguably stray into arbitrary power, which human rights provisions are designed to protect against. And I want us to bear that in mind, because I think those flaws within the international legal system are certainly being exploited when it comes to those who wish to attack and delegitimize Israel. So with that background in mind, let's turn to the report that was put out by Amnesty. In its original embargoed report, which was circulated in the days just prior to its publication, Amnesty International wrote, "The system of apartheid originated with the creation of Israel in May 1948 and has been built and maintained for decades. No one can be under any illusions that this is an attack on the Jewish state's very existence." And statements from Amnesty officials highlight that Amnesty's objective is ultimately the end of the Jewish state. We're all familiar with the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. It notes denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination by claiming the existence of the State of Israel as a racist endeavor. That is an example of anti-Semitism, and that is rife in this and other reports like it. And like many previous NGO publications, the Amnesty report manipulates, distorts international law, it distorts Israeli policy, it also distorts events on the ground, and it denies the Jewish people their right to sovereign equality and self-determination. It therefore falls foul of that definition, but certainly of any definition, I would suggest, of decency, even-handedness, and an equal approach that we would adopt. Now, it's hard to know where to start in giving you examples, and I took the opportunity of rereading the report before addressing you, which is no mean feat. It doesn't make easy reading because it is so very outrageous. But I thought I'd pick a few examples to give you a flavor of the issues that the report presents. The first is conflating Israeli Arabs and Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. This is a deliberate falsehood. It's where the report erases the notion of Israeli Arabs, citizens of Israel, with full political, civil, human rights. It conflates the citizens of Israel, those Arabs, with non-citizens of Israel, who are Arabs residing in the West Bank and Gaza. The vast majority of those are either under the control of Hamas, which is a designated terror organization and rules absolutely in the Gaza Strip, or they fall under the jurisdiction of the Palestinian Authority, which governs the majority of the West Bank. Both of those entities are markedly absent from this report, as are the real human rights abuses that are perpetrated against Palestinians by them. But the crucial issue is that in conflating Israeli citizens, Arab Israeli citizens, and non-Israeli citizens, the report generates a complete falsehood, and that is the very basis of all of the analysis that follows. The report also ignores a practical reality, which is that an overwhelming majority of Palestinians, those who aren't citizens living in East Jerusalem, prefer to live under Israeli rule. And that similarly, an overwhelming majority of Arabs living in primarily Arab towns such as al-Fahm wish their towns to remain in Israel. And it also ignores massive gains in the standard of living and the welfare of Arabs under Israeli governance. Now, there was an interview that I feel I have to reference in the Times of Israel that was conducted with representatives of Amnesty International at the launch of this report. It was conducted by Lazar Berman, and it was published in its entirety because the content of it was so extraordinary. It concerned Secretary General of Amnesty International Agnes Callamand and Amnesty International Middle East and North Africa Director and Advocacy Director Philip Luther. And the press conference was held in Jerusalem. And one of the questions that was put to them was about this polling. Berman said there were multiple Palestinian polls that find a clear majority of Palestinians admire Israeli democracy, including one that he put from 2016 that put that figure at 68%. He asked, how do you square that with allegations that Israeli democracy is an apartheid regime? Can you imagine any other apartheid regime where the majority of the oppressed group would say they admire that very regime? And it wasn't my question, so the Berman should take full credit for it. But the answer was extraordinary. Agnes Callamand says, how can I comment on a poll? I'm commenting on international human rights law. I mean, it's good. We're glad that the Palestinian people, 68% of them, feel that way. Under international law, what we have found is that the laws, policies, and practices that are currently in place amount to a system of apartheid. The problem is that the report does not do that. There is a similar manipulation over the legal constructs contained in the report, and in particular, the legal concept of apartheid. Now, there's no internationally recognized definition of apartheid. However, there are two international legal instruments that deal with the concept, in particular, the crime of apartheid. And neither definition is deployed by Amnesty because neither assists with the report's agenda. First, we have the 1973 International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid. And it defined the crime of apartheid as inhumane acts committed for the purpose of establishing and maintaining domination by one racial group of persons over another racial group of persons and systematically oppressing them. So that's one definition that exists in the international legal arena. The second definition is the crime of apartheid under the 2002 Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. And that concerns inhumane acts of a character similar to other crimes against humanity. It defines apartheid as being committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over another racial group or groups committed with the intention of maintaining that regime. Now, neither of those definitions, neither of those concepts, of course, applies to Israel, but it's important to note that the report doesn't even stay true to those definitions. The issues raised by Amnesty International in its so-called analysis concern differences in treatment between citizens of Israel and non-citizens of Israel, and Amnesty is seeking to introduce a warped definition. So a couple of other examples of issues in the report. One concerns Israel's law of return, and that was a law passed in 1950. Among Israeli laws related to the country's Jewish character that are referenced in the report is this law of return, and it provides for the founding purpose of the state, the ingathering of the exiles. Israel will be a refuge for any Jew. The law of return does grant special track rights to Jews from around the world seeking Israeli citizenship. Nothing in the law discriminates against non-Jewish Israeli citizens. And it's not unique by any stretch of the imagination. Other countries with diaspora populations, such as Ireland, Spain, Germany, they have instituted legislation specifically targeted for members of their diaspora. And they have a different process for citizenship applications. The law of return is consistent with standards of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which mandates that the establishment of special measures, such as the law of return, for the advancement of certain racial or ethnic groups for protecting the equal enjoyment or exercise of human rights and fundamental freedoms. And it's plain that the provision is intended to remedy inequalities resulting from the circumstances of history, to right the wrongs of history, and to ensure that another genocide against Jews can never happen again just because they have nowhere else to go. However, Amnesty launches into a discussion of this basic law by alleging that its sole purpose is to skew the demographics. It's all about demographic considerations. And it adds additional canards of expulsions and dispossessions in the process. Now, Amnesty's recommendations are a clear call for the elimination of Israel. It's demanding, in particular, what it refers to as the Palestinian right of return. It's really important to draw a distinction between the law of return that was passed in 1950 to provide that safe refuge for Jews, and what is claimed by many who are detractors of Israel as the right of return, which essentially calls for the destruction of the state of Israel. Now, it's been called for by Amnesty International in conjunction with the revocation of any laws and practices that protect Jewish identity and national expression. In particular, it has problems with the nation-state law. We can come on to talk about that in questions if people are particularly interested in it. But the main line on that is nothing much to see here. Essentially, that law didn't change anything substantive on the ground, but it was an important declaratory law. It was an important part of that constitutional process, which I explained was incremental, passed every few years in basic laws as opposed to as one constitutional document. Now, the right of return is claimed by the report to be internationally recognized, which is simply untrue. And the two instruments that Amnesty International cite in support of that argument are both non-binding. And even if they were not non-binding, they do not create that supposed right. Those instruments are the UN General Assembly Resolution 194 and the UN the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. there are many, many failings and shortcomings with the supposed legal analysis. The interview that I mentioned, I think, demonstrates the vacuum of any proper legal analysis that had been conducted. Because other than the platitudes and the canards, even the two individuals, the two senior officials that were put up by Amnesty International to answer questions on this report were unable to address anything of substance. So the report is consistent with that ongoing advocacy by Amnesty, and Amnesty is utilising it to call on the international community to implement anti-Israel BDS and lawfare. And when I spoke to you probably over a year ago, one of the sessions I did was specifically about BDS and lawfare, how it developed, and what the NGO machine behind it had evolved to become. And this is an important part of where we are seeing it has reached. The report's release was timed specifically at the beginning of this year to bolster the report, which was due in March 22 from the UN Special Rapporteur at the time, Michael Link. And it was also intended to influence the UN Human Rights Council's Commission of Inquiry into all underlying root causes of current tensions and protraction of the conflict, including systematic discrimination and repression based on national, ethnic, racial or religious identity. We can come on to talk a little bit more about that Commission of Inquiry and what it entails. But it's important to understand that this is a puzzle that fits together and a strategic initiative amongst NGOs from one report to feed into the other. And this is how the symbiotic relationship amongst these NGOs has been evolving. And in adding to demanding, the report demanding an end to arms sales to the Jewish state, it's called on Israel's allies in the West and the Arab world to use all political and diplomatic tools to ensure Israeli authorities implement the recommendations outlined in the report, which I've already explained would lead to the end of the Jewish state as we know it, and review any cooperation and activities with Israel to ensure that these do not contribute to the maintaining of the system of apartheid. It calls on the international community to urgently and drastically change its approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It calls on the UN Security Council to impose targeted sanctions, such as asset freezes against Israeli officials. And it calls for a comprehensive arms embargo, as I mentioned. It also calls for the UN General Assembly to re-establish the Special Committee against Apartheid in order to investigate Israel. Now, the irony is that currently Israel has a coalition government with wide representation, including from the Arab Ra'am party, and arguably it's the most diverse Israeli government in history. But Amnesty reiterates its standards calls to pressure the international community to enforce this embargo, to engage in BDS, and to intimidate corporations from ending business relationships with Israel, encouraging the Palestinian Authority to end its security cooperation with Israel. I mean, that's huge because it would lead to a complete destabilization of the situation and serious security implications for all involved. Petitioning the leaders of Arab countries and the burgeoning rapprochement between Israel and its neighbours. And that is also extraordinary because Amnesty International and those following its lead are seeking to break down the Abraham Accords. You know, the biggest promise for peace and coexistence and normalization and positive trade relationships in the region is something that these report writers see as worthy of calling out and trying to disassemble. Amnesty also calls on the International Criminal Court to consider the crime of apartheid in its current investigation. And it calls on all states to exercise universal jurisdiction to bring perpetrators, it says, of the apartheid crimes to justice. So there are a couple of political angles to think about in terms of what Amnesty International is calling for here. It specifically mentions the International Criminal Court. That is part of its organized campaign. there has already been a finding that there is a questionable finding, and certainly not a unanimous finding by Pretrial Chamber 1, that the court has jurisdiction over Israel on extremely dubious, convoluted grounds that are not, I would argue, in any way consistent with international law. And this investigation is ongoing, and we shall see what the new prosecutor determines with respect to it. But clearly, groups like B'Tselem, Human Rights Watch, and Amnesty intend these reports to try to pressure the International Criminal Court, the prosecutor, and his team to pick up the investigation, run with it, and one sees these reports and these calls periodically to mount up the pressure on that front. And that's at the ICC. We also, in parallel, see these reports feeding into initiatives at the UN, the blacklist that has been compiled by the UN Human Rights Council, and also its initiatives to rebrand Zionism as racism, trying to make Israel illegal under international law, and to mainstream this form of anti-Semitism with a consistent and specifically timed publication of these reports. They fundamentally deny the rights of the Jewish people. They fundamentally deny rights to Jewish people that are applicable to others. And they lead the campaign to ingrain this sort of new international law that specifically targets Israel and no one else, and to make that legitimate. I want to end just with a final stepping back and looking at the strategic approach to this report and those that have preceded it and those that will undoubtedly follow it. And it takes us back some years to an op-ed that appeared, penned by Mahmoud Abbas in the New York Times in 2011, where he essentially called for the internationalization of the conflict. He said Palestine's admission to the United Nations would pave the way for the internationalization of the conflict as a legal matter, not only a political one. It would also pave the way for us, he said, to pursue claims against Israel at the United Nations, human rights treaty bodies, and the International Court of Justice. And this is exactly what these NGOs are doing. They are doing Mahmoud Abbas's bidding in using and abusing international law and legal processes to attack Israel where other means had failed. That is why, when one sits down to read this report, the mind boggles, because it has no basis in reality, and anyone who has been to Israel or had any engagement with the legal and political systems in Israel will know that in an instant. US Ambassador Tom Nides, one of those such individuals who knows what he's talking about when it comes to Israel, tweeted in response to the report, "Come on, this is absurd." Short and to the point, and you may think there's not much more to say against the deluge of absurdities that are contained in those 287-odd pages. However, David Wormser, an American foreign policy specialist, told JNS shortly after the publication of the report that human rights NGOs like Amnesty have declared war on Israel's existence, and Israel must therefore get serious. And I would add to that it's not just Israel that needs to get serious. It's everyone around the world who recognizes the falsehoods here, the absurdities, and who recognizes the serious impact that this continuing deluge of misinformation is having, not just on mainstream media and individuals that you may meet on your street stalls or indeed in your communities more broadly, but unfortunately also on governments and on international organizations and intergovernmental institutions. And it's being driven by NGOs that hitherto had incredibly positive track records and justifiably positive reputations. And those reputations are, on the one hand, being tarnished, which is terrible for the real human rights violations around the world that need to be pointed out by the likes of Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, and that aren't being given the time and attention that they deserve, but that are also being harmed by the reduction in credibility of these organizations because of their targeting of Israel in this absurd manner. So unfortunately, it's bad news across the board, not least because this practice seems only to have gotten started. And one of the issues that is mentioned being international law and universal jurisdiction, I think is incredibly significant when we look to the future, because it means that we expect individual initiatives against individual Israelis in jurisdictions around the world on the basis of what is put into this report and what is then coming out of the UN Human Rights Council and other reports like it. So that is what is fueling the fire. And in the international legal system, we have these legal processes that are essentially being built upon the falsehoods and the misinformation in this report. So that's about half of the time that we have together. And I wanted to leave a substantial amount of time for questions, not least because I seem to give very long answers. But on that note, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention throughout my overview. And I'd be very happy to take questions, of course, not just on the Amnesty International report, but any issues of international law, Israel, the politicalization of these issues that we've been witnessing. So I very much look forward to hearing from all of you. And I think I'm going to have some help with taking some questions.
Thank you so much, Natasha. It was very interesting. Is there any questions from the audience? Please come to the stage. Don't be shy. Just come.
I should say that I'm always very impressed that I think the majority of you are doing all of this in a second language. So, take your time. Oh, we have a couple of questions that come up.
Yes, come. Upp på scenen. Du må gå upp på scenen. Because it's streaming, yeah. So it has to come. Perhaps you can invite the next one. Den neste må gjøre seg klar. Kom opp på scenen. Det skal streames.
Thank you so much. Do you use the Balfour Declaration or the San Remo a lot in your questions on the International Court?
You see, these aren't going to be short answers, so thank you for bearing with me. The answer essentially is no, I don't personally. And that's because the Balfour Declaration and the San Remo, the resolutions passed at San Remo, are, to my mind, hugely significant historical context. And they provide the political context also. And to a certain extent some of the legal context, prior to the establishment of the State of Israel. So for those of you who might not know, the Balfour Declaration is a declaration looking favourably upon the establishment of a homeland for the Jewish people in what was then Palestine. Significantly, it's from the British, who, of course, had held the mandate for Palestine in the relevant area. And at San Remo, we had a reaffirmation of the significance of the right of the Jewish people to self-determination. But that exists under international law in any event, especially now in 2022, where self-determination has become even more fundamental. What happens in 1948 with the establishment of the State of Israel is that it's almost as though the legal clock starts, because the legitimacy that Israel has in international law is just like any other state. It's not more important, it's not less important. Israel's statehood comes out of its Declaration of Independence. And the context in which that state declared independence was with a great deal of international support. In fact, you see the declaration references the sources of legitimacy for Israel's independence as coming from the Yishuv, the Jewish community that had already been establishing state institutions in the land of Israel, Eretz Israel, and the Jewish diaspora who supported it, the Zionist international movement. Those were the only sources of legitimacy that the people declaring the State of Israel required when they made that declaration. You see that the declaration references the international support, which came through the Balfour Declaration, through San Remo, even through the establishment of the Mandate in 1920, which was also significantly for the ultimate purpose of the Jewish people establishing a national homeland of their own. But that is the international recognition of the justification that is inherent in the Jewish people establishing their state when they did. And so after 1948, you don't need to go and point back to any additional sources of legitimacy, such as San Remo, such as the Mandate, or indeed the Balfour Declaration, because you have your birth certificate. You have the same right to exist as a state as the United Kingdom or the Americans when they declared independence. It was based on the natural rights of man. It wasn't based on anyone's gift. And in the case of Israel, it's particularly important to recognize this because many people say, oh, the UN created Israel. Well, if the UN created Israel, maybe they can take it away again. It's so important to recognize that the UN doesn't create states. It doesn't have the power to. The partition resolution that the United Nations General Assembly passed in 1947 has no legal status. General Assembly resolutions don't. The only resolutions that can be legally binding coming out of the United Nations are made very specifically under Chapter 7 by the Security Council. Anything else that is passed at the UN is a political statement. And this, in 1947, was a recommendation for partition which was flatly rejected by the local Arab population and Israel's surrounding Arab neighbors. And so it has no value. It could have been different, but history has taken a different turn. And so to answer your question finally, it's essentially the declaration of independence by Israel that we need to look upon and to rely upon, and to recognize the territory that essentially applied in the context that I was describing earlier with the application of uti possidetis iuris.
I should just briefly give you a little bit about my background because what I say is not kosher entirely. But I'm a Norwegian lawyer and I studied US law in America as a part of my Norwegian law study. And as an officer, I studied the laws regarding warfare. So I'm really interested, what you were saying, it really interested me on an intellectual level. At the same time, when I was in America, and I didn't think I ever had to use this argument because it was so self-evident. But there was one of the most famous justices in the US Supreme Court who said that the Constitution is not a suicide pact. So there is a limit to how much you can interpret it. And at first, I took great interest in following the legal arguments for why Israel had the right to exist. But the point is, these international treaties and whatever they are not a suicide pact either. So today, I just say, so what? I don't care. Nobody can expect Israel to listen to any of this nonsense. In my opinion, they are nonsense, but intellectually very interesting, So I'm not saying I'm against it, I'm just saying, who cares?
Well, the answer to that is a great many people, because they are, as you say, frequently cited. And there are issues in international, there is a point to be made, I should say, that international treaties do have a status in international law. And there is a legal status, and one could very well argue a legally binding obligations under both of the instruments that were mentioned in the previous question. But the real question is, what is the impact that it has today? And once we've answered that, the additional factor that I would introduce into the equation is, what is international law? Can you have an international legal system with one rule for Israel and a different rule for everyone else? Can any system have any legitimacy on that basis? And when you look to the general rules of international law and how the borders of emerging states are determined, that's as far as I think you need to go with the application of uti possidetis juris, because it tells you how the establishment of borders has developed over tens of years. And that is set out by the International Court of Justice in that Burkina Faso Mali case. It talks about the evolution of this principle. And that has to be something that is equally applied. You cannot have a double standard for Israel. No legitimate legal system can operate like that. And that's why I agree with you that the other instruments, the treaties, the international agreements, they're background noise to a certain extent after 1948. Having said that, there are subsequent agreements that have been very important. We've had the peace agreements between Egypt, Jordan. We've also very significantly had the agreements that the negotiations in this city led to. The Oslo Accords changed the landscape of the conflict between Israelis and Arab Palestinians forever. And there we can have a whole day devoted to the pros and cons of what was negotiated in this city. And clearly there have been enormous costs in blood since those accords were agreed upon, resulting incredibly through that change of dynamic. So there is a very important part that international legal agreements can have to play, but I absolutely agree with you, we need to be careful when saying that one necessarily trumps them all.
To begin with a very deep thinking comment on that previous question, how serious can an agreement be that has been discussed in a Norwegian ski resort named Beitostølen? But that's a side comment. Question, when Jeremy Corbyn was Labour leader, he was acting in a very strange way towards Jews and the state of Israel. And my question is, how should that be interpreted? Should that be interpreted as that there is big support for anti-Semitism in Great Britain, or mainly maybe that people don't care, or maybe that the dominance in the media is so great that it costs too much to stand up for Jews and Israel, so you just forget about it and go on to other things?
Well, anti-Semitism is frequently referred to as the world's oldest hatred. But as we heard yesterday, that hatred has gone through many manifestations and evolutions. And the analysis of the late great Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks was referenced in terms of anti-Semitism as a mutating virus. And I think that's incredibly pertinent when we look at what has happened to the Labour Party, what has happened under the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn, but also increasingly in academia and in other foundational institutions of our society. Anti-Semitism may always have been present, but we more recently have been educated that the old forms of anti-Semitism are unacceptable. We still see them online. We still saw them in a great number of messages on social media that were shared by members of Jeremy Corbyn's the anti-Semitic elements of the Labour Party. But more than that, we saw a hatred of Israel, because that is the current acceptable face of anti-Semitism. That is what it has evolved into. We heard that the current hatred of the Jews was focused on the Jewish state because of the importance of international law and human rights in the world today. But it's also because people can get away with hating Israel for no particular reason when they might be thrown out of their social clubs or their workplace or the pub if they said, oh, it's Jews that I hate. But accusing Israelis of heinous crimes and making untrue allegations about them is okay. And that's, I think, what we need to be pushing back against most significantly. But that is the phenomenon that we saw taking over the Labour Party. It's not past. Keir Starmer has done certainly a significant amount in rooting out those elements, but he's also limited in what he can do because the rot has gotten to the core of the party in such an extreme way. So, save for scrapping it and starting for the beginning, those underlying problems are going to be plaguing the Labour Party for many years to come. But it's the modern acceptable face of anti-Semitism which has allowed it to be so prevalent and so powerful.
Well, thank you so much for your presentation. And I just have a question in regards to international law. Since coming from a Norwegian and a more international view, we hear a lot about international law. It's illegal occupation and the perpetrators of the alleged human rights abuses in government in Israel and within the military should be put for trial. And I just have a question in regards to international law as a whole. Since you have the states as the United States who has passed laws that if anyone coming from the International Criminal Court that they are going to actively defend their own generals in what they have done around the world, and they would like to judge and by their own standards, and that the international community can't just come and arrest a US citizens. What is international law? What mandate does international law have to, for instance, some other countries accusing you outside of your own country's jurisdiction and just taking you straight out of context and pushing you towards being on trial for something that you allegedly have done without the international community's jurisdiction?
So I think the first problem we have to grapple with is that the concept of international law is enormous, and people are deploying it for their own advantage in ways that are desperately inaccurate and not reflective of what international legal institutions do and what powers they have. The main differentiating factor between a political and a legal institution is jurisdiction. And this is something with respect to the ICC that it clearly does not have over Israel. The jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court comes via the Rome Statute, which is the foundational document of the court. And states sign up to the Rome Statute if they want the court to have jurisdiction over their territory and over their nationals that are within that territory. Israel did not sign up to the ICC statute, to the Rome Statute. Neither did America. And it's interesting to note the reason why. Because it's the formation of the International Criminal Court was actually driven by a number of very prominent Jewish jurists, legal academics and legal practitioners who believed after Nuremberg that we needed a permanent international criminal court to bring the perpetrators of war crimes and crimes against humanity to justice. But it became quite clear in the negotiations over the Rome Statute that this was going to become a political organization to attack Israel. And the reason that became clear is because of the redefinition of one of the crimes within the statute, and that related to the transfer of populations into occupied territory, into or out of occupied territory. Famously, this is incorporated into the Fourth Geneva Convention, Article 49.6. That is the article that is used to attack Israel consistently over the building of Jewish communities in the biblical heartland of Judea and Samaria. And it is misapplied against Israel, it is abused, but in the Rome Statute they went one further and they introduced additional words for the definition of that crime, which was direct or indirect transfer. And that was clearly trying to mutate international law, trying to manipulate these provisions in order to attack Israel. That was a clear sign to the Americans and the Israelis, and they said, we want nothing to do with this. And since then, unfortunately, the court has had a terrible track record of successful prosecutions, and now is benefiting from a great deal of support because it has decided to investigate Israel. But I said to you that the court doesn't have jurisdiction against Israel, over Israel, I should say. And yet, I also said earlier that Pre-Trial Chamber 1 had made a finding of jurisdiction in the context of the investigation that the court is currently undertaking with respect to Israel. How has that happened? Well, in addition to the briefs by friends of the court, amicus curiae briefs, that were put in, including by UKLFI and many of the partners that we work with in the NGO arena, there were many briefs put in by the NGO network that is seeking to delegitimize Israel. And they were relied upon very heavily by the prosecutor in her application for a finding on jurisdiction, for a ruling, and they carried through. And Pre-Trial Chamber 1 made a legal determination, which is still open to challenge at later stages, that completely failed to take into account customary international law, like the rule of uti possidetis juris. And it manipulated international law and turned international law on its head. Some in the ministries in Israel were talking about this in terms of legal acrobatics. It's pretty extraordinary, the position that the court took to jurisdiction. I've argued that it's very important that other countries take note of this, and it's something that the UK in particular should be alive to, because of the activism of the court and its use as a political tool as opposed to a legal one. So that is essentially how it works. That is how they've managed to obtain supposedly jurisdiction even where it shouldn't exist. And that is unfortunate. I know we've got a couple more questions to take before we end. So I'll just say that this is a perfect example of the politicization of these international legal institutions to pursue these particular agendas.
Thank you.
Thank you. I will pick up the thread from the first question. Yes. You said in 1948 it was no more necessary to go back to Balfour 1917 and Sanremo 1920. Then come my question. In the peace agreement with Jordan 1994, this agreement refers to the borders of the League of Nations 1922. So then is the 1922 decision of interest legally?
Yes. Not necessarily the mandate, but the borders, absolutely, because those are the borders that Israel inherited under the application of uti possidetis juris. And it's not just the 1994 peace agreement between Jordan and Israel that references the borders of the previous mandate. It's also every ceasefire agreement that Israel and its neighbors agreed in 1949 after the War of Independence. It's also the peace agreement with Egypt. And the reason that these lines were referenced in the ceasefire agreements is that Israel's enemies at that time did not want to recognize its existence and weren't prepared to accept the establishment of Israel within any borders. So the easiest reference point was the pre-existing borders of the British Mandate. But that also underlines the application of uti possidetis juris in this context, because we have the need for, clearly in international law, clean lines, stability, certainty. That is what the application of uti possidetis juris does with respect to Israel in 1948. It provides that clarity, and that's also one of the reasons that these later agreements reference back to those borders.
And the last one.
So I'm Edward, the last one. First, the UN 1947, the UN partition plan. I think that the countries who voted for the selection of Israel, they have also a legal obligation to recognize not only de facto, but also de jure. This point I got from my good old friend, now dead. He was our representative at the Nuremberg trial in 1945-46. So that's it. And the second point about ICC, I'm not sure if I'm sure, but is it possible, is it impossible now that the ICC, the International Criminal Court, can bring an Israeli citizen before the court? Is that true?
Just dealing with that second question first. In the finding of jurisdiction currently, the state of play at the moment is that it could one day be true. But that depends very much on whether or not the investigation, because it is only at an investigation stage at the moment, has progressed. But if it does get to that point, then the question of universal jurisdiction becomes hugely significant, because then there could be individual petitions brought within other jurisdictions where Israelis may find themselves. And that's when you get the political targeting having a potentially devastating impact on individuals. So it is something that should be given a lot of serious thought to, and it's an additional reason we should be pushing back very strongly against the abuses of these international legal institutions. And to your first point, if only we could say that there was a legal obligation, but I think certainly a moral obligation. And certainly a moral obligation. But I think a moral obligation that is incumbent on all of us to defend the notion of any nation state. You know, a moral obligation that we all have to stand up for the right of Ukraine to exist and the right of Israel to exist. And anything that threatens states with annihilation, with Iran threatening to wipe Israel off of the map, with Russia rejecting the existence of the state of Ukraine, that threatens international legal order, because it is based upon nation states. That is how we, as human beings, have ordered ourselves and arranged the international legal processes. And when that order is undermined, it won't just stop with Israel. Patricia earlier was saying it starts with the Jews, but it doesn't end with the Jews. And unfortunately, the erosion of legitimacy of international legal proceedings, I think, is already being felt. The human rights abuses that we have been seeing recently in Ukraine, the international legal processes to condemn those are very, very much weaker as a result of the fact that they have been so abused over so long with respect to Israel, in my opinion. That is, I think, what we are seeing, the direct effects of the abuses of these legal processes, and it's incredibly sad and concerning for the future of international law and justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much.